why the U.S. declares war and eventually how the U.S. declares war, and then kind of what life is like in the United States once war is declared. And so this quote here by President Wilson, who was the president of the United States during World War One, kind of provides a clear picture of why they're doing it, right? And it's, this idea of property can be paid for, but the lives of peaceful and innocent people cannot be, right? And so that'll make more sense once we start talking about this German submarine warfare in the following slides, right? And this is either that the world must be safe for democracy, right? So kind of putting this altruistic or this ideal goal to it, and not really making it selfish or in America's interest necessarily, just in the interest of the world. So leading up to the United States entering the war had been going on for several years, right? The war starts in 1914. The United States doesn't send troops over until 1918. So for about 4 years' time, where the war is happening, and the United States isn't actually involved. But it doesn't mean the war is not affecting the United States. And so once the war starts, the British Navy blockades the German ports, so port cities, to prevent from ships going in and out, to kind of strangle the German economy, to kind of force them to surrender. The Germans respond by using submarine warfare, kind of one of the earliest examples of submarine warfare. And they were called U-boats, underwater boats. And they just indiscriminately sunk ships. Anything in kind of the zone that they deemed open waters, the German U-boats would sink, even American ships, right? So even American merchant ships were sunk, so it was affecting the American economy. Kind of an infamous event is the sinking of the Lusitania, which was I believe a British ship, but it was carrying a lot of American passengers. And so on May 17th, 1915, off the coast of Ireland, the ship was sunk, killing 128 Americans. And this turned a lot of Americans kind of against Germany and the Central Powers. Before then, they kind of were fully involved in this idea of neutrality and not getting involved. In addition, German immigrants were one of the largest immigrant groups in the United States, right? So there's this that kind of allegiance to the homeland, the motherland, right? That doesn't go away. And so before this, there really isn't as much opposition against Germany as, we might think today. But this is one of the major turning points back in 1915. The Germans continue this unrestricted submarine warfare, and that eventually will cause the Americans to join the conflict. In addition to this, right, the Germans kind of see the writing on the wall in some senses, knowing that the Americans probably will eventually get involved. And so to kind of prevent that from happening, they try to be sneaky, the Germans, essentially, and they send secret telegraphs, private diplomatic telegraphs to Mexico, right? And they try to convince Mexico to declare war on the United States, and hoping this would prevent them from joining a European affair. The Germans promise that if they go to war and they're successful, right, they will recognize, the Germans would recognize Mexico's claim to land they had lost back in the Mexican-American War back in the 1840s. So most of the southwestern United States, Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, and parts of California. So that was kind of their way to entice them into doing it. This Zimmerman note is intercepted, right? The American intelligence agencies get a wind of it, and this kind of further alienates Americans' popular support for Germany, and they start kind of clearly siding with the Allies. In addition to this, they continue sinking American ships even after they kind of promised not to. And then on the Eastern Front in Germany, Russia actually makes a peace treaty with Germany. Russia is kind of destroyed by this war. And in the midst of the war, there's a communist uprising in Russia as well. And so now, with Russia done, right, this clearly, Germany has the upper hand at this point. And so the United States, now the public support is against them, are leaning more towards trying to stop Germany from taking control. So eventually war is declared in 1917, but by the time they actually send troops over, it's a bit, it's in 1918. But the Selective Service Act is passed in 1917, and this requires all eligible men to sign up for conscription or to sign up for the draft, so possibly forcing, essentially, men to serve in the army. The army does remain segregated, unfortunately. It's not until after World War II that the army becomes integrated, right? So there are African Americans, there are Hispanics, there's Asian Americans, and Native Americans are all fighting, and they were conscripted as well, but they were not in interracial battalions or barracks. And then the first thing they have to kind of take care of, especially once they declare war, is protecting merchant ships that are bringing supplies to the British and to the future American soldiers, right? They need to protect them. So they establish this convoy system to protect their merchant ships. And so kind of in this safe zone in the middle of several defensive naval ships, you would have the merchant ships carrying the supplies. And they would be protected by destroyers and cruisers and other naval ships against these enemy submarines that were trying to attack them. So the Americans join the war, they declare war, and then they establish what's called the American Expeditionary Force. Because before really this time, before World War II, the United States did not have a large standing army, right? They had some members who were permanent soldiers. Most people, when they had to go to war, were drafted or signed up, right, for a period of time. And so the idea of like a U.S. Army isn't fully established, but they call the American troops that go over to Europe the American Expeditionary Force, the AEF. It was led by General John J. Pershing, who is an important military leader. And it's really important because they boost morale for the Allied armies, right? All of a sudden you have thousands of troops who had not been experiencing this brutal warfare for 4 years, the trench warfare and no man's land, right? These people are totally new to it. And so they're coming in, right? And this boost of fresh soldiers boosts the morale of the Allies, and it kind of destroys the morale of the Central Powers, of the Germans. A really important aspect of the war is that it is totally one of the first really modern wars, right? All these modern weapons that really had never been used before are suddenly being used and being used a lot, right? So airplanes, for example, and airships, really important, right? To kind of get the aerial view and dropping bombs and flying over enemy territory to kind of understand what's happening behind enemy lines. Huge advancement. Machine gun power is increased. They had machine gun type weapons even as early as the Civil War, but this is kind of much more powerful. Poison gas, unfortunately, the use of chemical warfare is not outlawed until after World War II, I believe. But poison gas is used to kind of wipe out people in the trenches. This gas would kind of fill the lungs up with chlorine and essentially drown somebody, right? It was really horrible. So they had to start wearing gas masks in order to protect themselves against that. And then tanks and even more larger and more advanced naval ships kind of come into play during World War I. The war fighting officially ends on what is called Armistice Day, and is celebrated on November 11th, 1918, 11/11. Germany agrees to a truce, right? And then eventually, about 7 or 8 months later, the Treaty of Versailles, which officially ends the war, is signed in June of 1919. But we'll talk more about kind of the end of the war next lesson. So kind of what's going on at home during all this? You have what we call total war, because the entire economy has to be directed towards the war effort. It's one of the first times this happens in U.S. history where all resources are needed to direct at the war. And so Congress gives President Wilson kind of increased powers to do what he has to do, which includes establishing things like the War Industries Board in 1917. And this War Industries Board is allowed to fix and regulate prices, right? That's something that the U.S. government had never done before, saying that, prices for bread, for example, cannot go above this price, right? There has to be this price, setting prices for things. That kind of goes against the ideas of a capitalist society where the market is supposed to guide prices, right? If there's supply for it and there's demand, like that affects the price. Now you have the government coming in and saying this is what it has to cost, right? In order to make sure it's affordable for people to buy, in order to make sure the government can buy it in bulk. It also nationalizes certain industries, so certain industries come completely under the control of the federal government instead of being private, which is also something that's very anti-capitalist, but seen as necessary during the war. But regardless, during all this, there's still tension between capitalists and the owners of corporations and the labor, the workers who work there. The economic policies that were put in place to help with the war effort raises the cost of living, which causes corporate profits to go up, but workers' wages also rose, but because of inflation, right, the increase in value of goods, their cost of living went up. So it really didn't make workers' lives any better. It's actually during World War I that union memberships hit record high levels. And over 6,000 strikes, various strikes occurred during the war, right? So labor took advantage of the situation. They knew they need us to work, right? This is war. They need the entire economy dedicated to the war effort. So if we either threaten to strike or strike now, they're going to have to kind of settle the disagreement quickly so they can get us back to work, right? So they use this as an advantage to kind of gain certain benefits and increase their power and influence. At home, though, you also have people trying to pitch in, so to speak, to kind of make sure the war is successful. And so you have a lot of people, because of the food rationing, they had to send lots of food over to Europe to the soldiers. People begin creating what they call victory gardens, right, in their backyards, in public parks. And these victory gardens, they grow food to kind of help with this effort to help limit the effects of food rationing. And it was seen as a very patriotic thing to do. In addition to this, you have the government establishing something called the Committee on Public Information. And this was a way for the government to kind of market the war, right? Say the war is good, this is why we're great at doing it, and all this stuff. It's what we call propaganda, right? Providing a one-sided view of something to kind of promote patriotism and nationalism. And so they do this to kind of promote this for the United States involvement in the war. Unfortunately, when kind of everything's directed at the war itself, some civil liberties or civil freedoms can be sacrificed at times. During the war and right after the war, you have what's called the Red Scare, when the Americans kind of are rooting out communists, so-called alleged communists in the government. People are kind of arrested for things that they might not normally be arrested for, and things of those nature. There's a lot of anti-immigrant attitudes, particularly towards the Germans at this time. They're not really trusted, a lot of the Germans, because people think, well, they're German, they might be on the side of Germany and against the United States. And so, again, something called the Espionage and Sedition Acts are passed. Kind of unconstitutional. If you remember back from last year in Ms. Gilson's class, the Alien and Sedition Acts passed by John Adams is similar and was also faced similar conflicts with people. And so anyone who was found to interfere with the war effort, promote disloyalty, or say profane things with the government, right? So essentially limiting someone's First Amendment rights to say whatever they want. And they would be arrested or fined for that. And the government took advantage of this to persecute a lot of labor leaders who were striking during this time and trying to promote the rights of workers, were kind of taken advantage of with this act. Another interesting thing that happens during World War I within the United States is what's called the Great Migration. And so since the Civil War era, to this point during Reconstruction, right, the majority of African Americans in the United States lived in the South, right, where they continued to live in extreme poverty, and many of them almost in this slave labor type environment. With the outbreak of World War I, you have a decrease in European immigration, so you're not getting that large amount of people coming over from Europe because the war is happening. But at the same time, you're having an increased demand for labor in the factories because more and more factories are being built to meet the demands of the U.S. Army. And so what happens is you need someone to fill those spots. And so these many African Americans from the southern part of the United States begin moving into these northern industrial cities like New York, Chicago, Baltimore, cities in Ohio, right? All these industrial cities. And so between 1910 and 1930, you have hundreds of thousands of African Americans. That's a major, what we call demographic shift, right? Changing of the population. Move into New York, right? Move into Chicago, places like Harlem. And they seek a better life, right? And for many, it is better than what they were experiencing in the South, right? The sharecropping of the South was brutal, hard labor for not much pay. They kind of see their status rise a bit, but they are still facing tough discrimination and housing discrimination. They're kind of forced into certain neighborhoods. And from time to time, there are race riots, right, in different parts of the country between African Americans and white people, right? So it's definitely not this rosy, great improvement, but it is something better. It is definitely better for most of the African Americans who leave the South for the North. Right? You also have, in addition to that, you have women begin working in larger numbers in factories like this. Here they're assembling an airplane wing, right? Pretty interesting stuff, right? And so this is kind of one of the starts of women trying to gain more rights. And I don't think it's any coincidence that shortly after the war, in 1920, women gained the right to vote as well, right? So their kind of efforts in the war help promote their standing, so to speak, in the country. And lastly, right, kind of appropriate for our own times today, you have the Spanish flu. So in the midst of this crazy war, American involvement, total war effort, great migration, people moving into the country's demographics are changing. In 1918, you have a flu pandemic that sweeps across the world. It's called the Spanish flu, not because it started in Spain, because it was first reported among soldiers in Spain. It's actually believed to have started out in Kansas, think on a pig farm. Um, but it spreads like wildfire. It's very contagious. And what's unusual about this one is that it affects young, healthy people just as much as it affected kind of the elderly and others who are more at risk. So about an estimated 500,000 Americans are killed from this, and about 30 million worldwide, right? So much more severe, at least currently, than the COVID crisis, but similar in a sense that it swept across. People were quarantining, people wore masks, lots of sanitation efforts to kind of prevent the spread of the virus, right? And it hit New York particularly hard as well. I believe something like 20,000 people in New York City died from this flu. So kind of a crazy time, lots of things happening, right? But total warfare, this kind of culture of propaganda and not speaking out against the government becomes popular. Anti-German feelings become popular, and so this is kind of what people in the United States are experiencing during this war. You can use this information now to help you kind of work on the next component of your project, which is the war at home.